Alright, so let's start with a fairly simple tail, which can be used of material from game birds, from poultry, hen hackle fiber, rooster hackle fiber. It doesn't really matter because it all pretty much amounts to the same thing. But there's a couple of things that are really important that you need to remember about this. Almost all feathers, when they're attached to the quill, obviously go away from it, but they're at relatively different distances, and ideally what you need to do is to maintain all of the points of those fibers becoming aligned. And the way that you do that is you pull them out at a right angle to the stem. So for example, we've done that here. We've pulled those out at a right angle to the stem. The next thing is this. Assuming you've got clean stem below, if you just grip the fiber like this with the left hand and tear it with the right, well, typically you will maintain all those tips in alignment. What I commonly see people do is this. They'll pick up the fiber like this, they get the scissors and they cut a chunk of them out, pull that away, but if you look very carefully, you see there's a very marked difference. These are long, these are short. So it's impossible to get a perfect alignment at the tail end if you do it by that means. So bear that in mind. At any time that you take fiber from a quill, feather or whatever, make sure that you pull them out into an alignment before attempting to tie this in for the tail medium of your fly. The next important element is proportionate value. And that's kind of something that's it's difficult to teach somebody. It's something you acquire with the years that you learn to tie, but essentially you can have some kind of, if you like to put it, means of recognition. Whether or not the trout pay attention to that at times, I really wouldn't like to argue about that, but what I do know is if fly is tied effectively more proportionately correct, then to my eyes at least it looks a little bit better so far as out of the box, so to speak, and into the water. Okay, now let me just show you something here. The easiest way to try to understand this is, or get to some sense of understanding proportionate value, is first and foremost, don't do this, which is common. They grab the material like this and they start cranking the thread around a bit. You can't see where that tail is at this point of time. The way to go about that is simply this, is you hold the feather in your right hand and then you hold it to a position where you can see how much material is extending past the bend of the hook. For example, that is obviously too short. On the other hand, that may be too long for the particular fly you're tying in question. However, given the fact that I know, roughly speaking, the relationship of hook length to the length of tail, if I bring that approximately to that position there, I know I'm going to be somewhere around about right. Now, without moving the right hand, transfer over to the left. But let me explain something else to you. Typically, most people, when they tie a fly, do so by grasping the material in their thumb and their forefinger. And if you notice how these fingers come together, they kind of are not square. They cross over like this. Whereas if you learn to use these two fingers in that manner, they're nearly square and you get more visible material extended past the end of those those fingers to work with. Okay? Alright, so we're going to pick up the material. We've assessed the length. We're going to hold that very gently on the top of the shank of the hook, and we're going to take one wrap of thread. Okay, now if this tail material is anywhere other than on the top of the shank of the hook, do not continue to wind any thread because you've got it incorrectly positioned and you're going to have to try to correct that with thread. Make sure that the first wrap of thread sets that material directly on the top of the shank of the hook. From that point onwards, we're going to hold the material with these fingers in an upward inclination. And if you do that, as you take successive wraps of thread, you will always maintain the fact that the material stays above the shank of the hook. Okay, now you can or you cannot, it's entirely up to you, but you could take a soft wrap of thread just back behind the tail one time, like this. And then we're going to continue back up the body of the fly, and we're going to secure the butts of that tail medium that we've tied in to a point whereby we don't end up having to tie it down close to the eye. That's a simple formula to tying a tail. So we're going to pick ourselves up another hackle. Okay, pull the hackle fiber away, the hackle stem away. Now this time we're going to start this end, but the same thing applies. We have to make sure that we have got proportionate values as far as extension of the tail medium past the bend of the hook. And again, we're going to use the right hand to do that. We're then going to take over where the position needs to be, the left. We're going to make one wrap of thread. We're going to make sure that that's where it needs to be. And we're going to hold the tail uppermost. And we're going to gently reverse the thread back down towards the bend of the hook to the extremities of where no thread needs to be. We're going to take one little turn there and we're going to set that back. And what we did there, we've tied in the tail medium by starting just behind the eye, back down. But the object of the exercise is that we built a flat, uniform underbody, regardless of whatever else we're going to tie on top. And then we're just going to cut off the excess. Now, I never wrap thread over itself twice. Remember that. We started here. By the time we got to the bottom end, the tail is 100% secured. If we now tie in a ribbon medium, or we're going to double body, or whatever else, as we come back, we're still not doubling thread over. In other words, each process of tying traps down the material that's next in line, but doesn't build up excessive bulk to hold that particular material in place. Some material that's traditionally used for traditional wet flies, and typically those that we showed you earlier on, lake and loch flies, incorporate the use of golden pheasant and the tippet material and or the crest feather, which is what this is. And this is kind of a little different from, shall we say, tearing off a few fibers of hackle fiber, because you've got to kind of prep this material too. You know, you can't just tie the feather in like that. You can if you want to, but it's not going to be too good if you do it. So what you're going to do is you're going to grip the fiber like this at the tip end, and you're going to strip all the fiber off that you don't need. Now if you look at this feather, it's kind of hard to determine which is the more positive angle of inclination of the fiber. And typically when you buy golden pheasant crest like this, that's kind of like what you're looking at when you get one. Let me show you how to overcome that problem. Real simple. Wet it. And what that does, it draws all the fibers together, as you can see, and you get more of a visible alignment of where all those fibers are. And from that point onwards, again, what we're going to do is we're going to assess exactly where we need the fiber to be. And typically with golden pheasant, it's a kind of a short upturned tail medium that you're looking for. Take the feather, place it on top of the hook, one soft turn, make sure we see where it needs to be, and if we need to shorten it up a bit, that's fine. You've not wrapped it that tight that you can't do it. Keep the thread up, tail up, come back round, make one soft turn behind the back of the hook. That kind of just gives it a little kick, and that's how we would tie in a really nice proportionate valued golden pheasant crest tail. Many of the old kind of flies that imitated the caddis flies ironically had what would you define really as the antenna of the natural fly incorporated into the tail, which is kind of back to front when you think about it, but bear in mind these are typically wet fly patterns too, and it's very difficult to tie a long antenna over the front of the eye of the hook and expect them to retain that position in the first place. So I guess really it's an issue of confusing the fish. And some of the patterns that we're going to tie a little later on during the DVD will demonstrate otherwise to you. So this is bronze mallard, and it's absolutely the most ideal feather to use for this medium. And what we're going to do is we're going to take two of those strands out like that, pull them off. Now we're not going to kind of relate to the normal issues of proportionate value, because these are going to represent the antennae of the caddisfly, but ironically they're at the tail end and not the head end. But nevertheless, the same thing relates to technique of tying. Make sure that you've got the proportionate value of the material extended past the bend of the hook where you want it. When you do, secure it with one wrap of thread in that position, reverse the thread back down, and then get the tail medium where you want it. So now we're looking at two mediums that represent the antennae of the caddisfly. And typically flies, you know, in the partridge and hare's ear orientation, woodcock and hare's ear, which are some of my absolute favorite flies for imitations of caddisflies, would incorporate that. There are some flies that also incorporate what I would define as more feather structure in their tail. In other words, if you take a quill, whether it's from a duck, whether it's from a goose or turkey, whatever, and an entire strip is actually taken out. And typically an Alexander is one of those flies. So what we do is we separate the amount of fiber needed by definition of width and whatever proportionate value for the hook in turn. Again, it's up to you whether you choose to tear it off or cut it off. I prefer just to tear it off. What we're going to do is this. Now, if you look very carefully at this feather, it's got an inclination either in an upward direction, or if you reverse it, in a downward direction. What you should do is incorporate the tail of this particular feather fiber, i.e. solid, what I call solid feather fiber, with an upturned inclination. And when we get into winging techniques, I'll explain a little bit more the reasons why that also is an issue, whether it's tied with an upswept or a downswept value. Okay, same thing. We're going to just check out what our proportionate value is. Is that too long? Is that too short? No, we're going to be somewhere around about right there. Now, one important thing with a lot of material is that you need to learn what we call in the tying terminology a pinch and loop technique. In other words, it's not just a question of grabbing the material like this and wrapping thread. So what that amounts to is simply as this. First of all, assess the relative position where that material needs to be tied in. Secondly, take the two fingers, and I typically use this one as opposed to the first, and hold the material above the shank of the hook in exactly the position where you want it to be. But make sure it actually touches the hook. It's not held above it, it's not compressed to it. It's just touching the hook. You're going to raise the thread bobbin up, and you're going to gently put thread in between the two fingers, and you're going to start to bring the thread back down. As soon as you start to see a visible movement of thread compressing that material, then you pinch the thread, the hook, and the feather, and then tighten the thread. If you do that, notice how the tail is set exactly where you want it to be. And what we can then have to do is continue to wrap the thread back into the rearward direction to further secure the tail exactly where we want it to be. One little wrap behind locks it, and we've got the tail set in the position that we need it to be. The butt section is going to be incorporated into the underbody of the fly, and that gives you a better proportionate value too. The ideal scenario is that you have a taper to the body of the fly. It's thin tapered at the tail end, and it gradually increases in thickness as you work towards the eye of the hook. If you were to cut this off right here, what you're going to do is you're going to create a hump or a lump. Whereas if we reverse the thread back and carefully incorporate on the top of the shank of the hook that material, if you watch very, very closely, there's no ugly bumps or lumps. So it's all nice and evenly proportionate till we get to that point. Another little trick of the trade too. You want to cut this material off real tight to the shank of the hook. Don't just grab it and cut away like this. Pick it up and twist it, and see how tight it comes to the shank of the hook. Always put the blade of the scissor behind also. Put it back to the blade and cut it off. And it's about as 100% neat as you can ever get it. A couple more exceptions to the rule, and this probably is the one that is of more concern, shall we say, for what I would define as the more flashy kind of flies. And that's actually where a tail medium is actually what we call a married wing structure. In other words, what we're going to do is we're going to marry 2, 3 different strands of different colors together to form the tail. Let me just explain to you that you have both what we could define as left side and right side quills, and typically where tails are concerned, depending on the size of the fly, most times you can get away with just taking a strip from 2 sides of the same. In other words, we take a strip out from that, and we take another strip out from this, and as long as we don't mess those fibers around, what we then do is we pick one up and we place it on top of the other like this, and we gently stroke those to marry those fibers together. And form a tail that's of 2 strands married together like this, and that is then just dyed in as we did for a simple strip, single colour. So we build in a married tail factor.